When explorers were first looking around Alberta, it wasn't clear if Alberta was entirely desert or arable prairies, but as it turned out, Alberta's land can grow all sorts of crops and raise a variety of animals. In fact, the Peace River country in northern Alberta is the farthest north in the Americas where you can grow grain. Alberta's economy once depended almost entirely on agriculture, but since then they have diversified their economy. If Alberta was just a farm province with nothing good in it, it wouldn't be very important. After all, London had no important resources like coal or oil, but it's an important city because it's located at the center of trade for Northern Europe. But Alberta is physically isolated from commerce, being located at the far west of Canada between the Rocky Mountains and endless kilometers of plains. Because of Alberta's isolation, the province is highly dependent on its natural resources for economic stimulation. In the colonial era, Alberta's most valuable export was fur, but because people stopped wearing fur hats, the fur trade went into decline. During times of economic hardship, more people leave Alberta than enter. This happened 2 times, once during the Great Depression, when 42,000 people left the province and entered, and again in the 1980s when 35,000 people left the province and entered. But Alberta has an ace up its sleeve. Millions of years ago, Canada's interior was once a massive ocean that shrunk into a sea, then into a lake, and eventually into settled land. This ancient ocean was rich with life, and later made the land rich with coal and oil. The first pioneers of Alberta saw that the land was rich with bitumen. Bitumen is another way of saying oil sands. Bitumen is viscous dirt that has oil in it, and bitumen has been used throughout history. In ancient Mesopotamia, they used bitumen to make their boats waterproof. In fact, they made a lot of things waterproof using bitumen. But of course, back in 1000 BC, they were stupid, so they didn't know that the material they were using to cover their boats with would later become one of the most valuable materials in the world. But because of how knowledge spreads, up until the 19th century, Native Americans were using bitumen to waterproof their stuff too. And just as a side note, bitumen cannot catch fire. An important explorer named Alexander Mackenzie said, at about 24 miles from the mouth of the Athabasca and Clearwater River are some bituminous fountains into which a pole of 20 feet long may be inserted without the least resistance. But despite the observation that there was a lot of oil in Alberta, they couldn't really do anything to extract the oil because it was the 19th century and they didn't invent the technology yet. So instead of extracting the oil, they started to mine coal. Coal was first mined in Lethbridge, Alberta in 1872, and today Alberta produces 40% of Canada's coal. In 1883, they discovered natural gas and started extracting it. Today, Alberta produces over 85% of Canada's natural gas. But the most important discovery was made when they found liquid oil near Calgary in 1914. Alberta does have liquid oil, but there isn't a lot of it, and most of it is located in the south. This discovery of oil didn't really kick off Alberta's oil industry. They had to wait another 34 years until a major oil reserve was discovered near Edmonton Leduc oil fields in 1947. This discovery was what really brought Alberta into the spotlight as Canada's main oil producer. But what about the oil sands? Well, during all this time, scientists were trying and failing to create a method to separate the oil from the sand until they managed to do it by using steam and pressure. I'm not going to explain the process of how they separated the oil from the sand because that's scientific stuff, and I'm talking about history. But what's important about the process is that it's expensive. Some people did try to make a profit off the oil sands, but most of them went bankrupt because it was simply too costly. The first profits were made in 1967 when Suncor Energy managed to make the sands profitable by using new technology. And from that point forward, more investors started to look to Alberta with dollar signs in their eyes. The oil reserves in Alberta are estimated to be larger than Saudi Arabia. In fact, the area which the oil sands cover is larger than England. It contains 75% of North America's oil reserves. And right now, Alberta produces 97% of Canada's oil. The history of Alberta is bland. It is basically what you would expect from a western cowboy state being settled in the industrial era. You can separate Alberta's history into 4 periods: the Native American period, the colonial period, and the settlement period, and then modern times. In the colonial period, Alberta was owned by the Hudson's Bay Company, who were only interested in fur trading and legally restricted any permanent settlement in their lands. Canada bought rich land from the Hudson Bay Company and opened it up to settlements. Shortly after the first colonists arrived in Alberta, Alberta's population grew very slowly until farmland in the United States ran out, and Europeans started to look to Canada. In 1905, Alberta became big enough that it became its own province, but this was when the first struggle came. When Alberta was made a province, the federal government mandated that resources in Alberta didn't belong to Alberta and in fact belonged to the federal government. You can see how this law made Albertans a little angry. Well, in fact, it made them a lot angry. But 25 years later, the law was repealed. Alberta was colonized using railroads and banks. These corporations were essential to the lives of Albertans. Because the head offices of the banks and railroads were located in the east, Albertans grew resentful of the east. Later on during the Great Depression, Alberta went bankrupt, and Eastern Canada did not do anything to ease Alberta's pain, further dividing Alberta and the East. The Western provinces in general have clashed with the federal government, and in course have indirectly fought with Ontario and Quebec. Eastern Canada has a far bigger population than the West. Ontario and Quebec combined control 61% of Canada's population. The Greater Toronto Area alone has more seats than Alberta and Saskatchewan combined. The population of Ontario and Quebec tends to be more economically and socially liberal, which means more taxes and regulations for Alberta. Albertans are more economically conservative than anything else. They aren't really culturally conservative, meaning that they are okay with some of the social changes going on in Canada. So when Ontario and Quebec mandate to Alberta that higher taxes are needed to maintain a welfare state, Albertans get angry because that wasn't what they voted for. In the 2019 election, the Liberals won 0 seats in Alberta and Saskatchewan, except for one new Democrat seat in Edmonton. But think about that for a second. Jagmeet Turbin did not campaign in Alberta at all, and in spite of the NDP's complete and total rejection of Alberta, they still managed to win 1 seat there. Imagine that. And despite these taxes and regulations from the federal government, Alberta has the highest GDP per capita in Canada. Alberta has a GDP per capita higher than Switzerland and Sweden, and Alberta also has the 3rd largest GDP in Canada, right behind Quebec. Because Alberta has been antagonized by the East, some Albertans think it is better if they leave Canada. About 25% of Albertans are in favor of separation, and ever since the 2019 election, more people are coming to the separatist cause. And why should Alberta stay in Canada? According to Trudeau, Canada has no national identity. Canada is just a collection of individual people that are only motivated by economic interest. And it would be literally better for Alberta if they joined the United States, because it would boost their GDP and they would have a larger market to export their oil to. If Alberta stays in Confederation, they will have to work out their issues with the East and deal with the taxes that they hate so much. The great thing about Alberta is that they can punch far above their weight, and if they are smart, they can utilize their massive oil reserves to bully the federal government. Another problem is managing their oil reserves. Alberta must make sure that they don't exploit their oil reserves to the detriment of their environment, and that the money from extracting oil reaches the people. In Alberta, they have been doing a fairly good job of taxing money from the oil companies and giving it to the people, so if they continue to do that, that will be good. Although they have been doing a less than okay job of not ruining their environment, some World War I movies are filmed in the oil sands because the ground there is so brutalized and disgusting, it looks like World War I took place there. Alberta has been through tough times in the past, and even today they are facing big challenges, but they have proven that they are robust and can handle pressures put on them. If they manage to improve upon the current state of affairs and challenge the powers oppressing them, then the 21st century will become the Albertan century. Subscribe.